And that's why, as many of the independent commentators have said, that the directors who remain on the boards of these institutions, who were there at the time, unless they have evidence that they objected to the strategies or gave them thought and unbalanced, and why unbalanced they gave the approval to increase the size of the bank or to increase the loan activities into certain areas at the massive, they were alarming and massive rates by reference to any historical context in banking, 20% plus and 30% growth rates a year compound is shocking. It impairs and it actually imperils customers' deposits. It's a flagrant lack of fiduciary responsibility. And auditors who didn't see that and draw attention to it and flag it in red, bold in the reports also failed in their professional duty, in my opinion. Ireland is in a very serious place at the moment. 120 billion of very bad lending took place in about 4.5 years.
It's down between the institutions, Peter.
Pardon?
You break that down between the institutions.
Yes, there was 397 billion. It was on an earlier spreadsheet type sheet that I gave all the members some time ago. And roughly about 125 billion in AIB, in their total loan book, about 130 billion in Bank of Ireland.
No, the 120 million you spoke.
Sorry, that is actually, what I have done there is I've used as a base the 80 billion of loans that were identified for NAMA purposes. And I would, from my experience, and my experience is extensive in this area, Kieran, I would say that there is at least, some of it has been repaid, but there certainly was 40 billion on top of that 80 by experienced estimates. Don't get hung up on those figures. Stay with the figures they've given us. And that I've only used the figures they've given us for the purpose of doing the calculations. Yeah. But we've just heard only a half an hour ago that in the case of Anglo, the 72 billion loan book roughly divides 36 into what's going to NAMA. And the chairman there said that, Anglo is now a new animal. We've got rid of 36 billion. The remaining 36 divides about 24 and 12 or 23 and 13. They said there's a residual 12 to 14 billion of good loans that could be the bulk of the base for a new bank, and the others would be run-down loans over a period of years. Well, if the chairman thinks that it was, that we have a new animal with new boards and all the rest, I would suggest that perhaps the animal that's been created has been a Trojan horse, which has come in to actually tax the taxpayers unnecessarily. Because the 120 billion of bad lending that was done, 80 billion they've declared. There's 50 billion of that will never be collected, ever.
What are you basing that on, Peter?
Because they've declared it already. The loans going into NAMA, they've told us 55% of them won't be collected. And in the case of AIB, even for the purpose of showing that their capital requirement is 9.6 billion, rounded to 10, I've only taken a 40% write-down level.
Okay.
But the truth, let's get to the truth, because if we can measure the truth of where this country lies, we have a far better chance of addressing it and getting it right. By coincidence, yesterday, when Patrick Honohan, the governor of the central bank, was presenting here, and I read the report, and I think what he said was very apt. He said, perhaps hold back from going into sort of a juggernaut 6-month commission of investigation that mightn't know where to go. Hold back and start maybe thinking about what you want to do with that 6 months. And he suggested that maybe the starting point, and it comes from what he arrives in his conclusions, that perhaps auditors, accountants, directors, etc., what did they do merits a bit of magnifying glass. And I'd agree with that. But if 50 billion, and I'm going to be truthful here and say my experience and judgment tells me it'll be 60 billion to get it right, has to be written off. Well, that's a bill that has to be split amongst the people in this country who bore responsibility for it who backed it, who put the funds forward that created those assets that can't be collected. And they were, in the first instance, the banks. And who are the banks? They're their shareholders. And that the people who provide capital to them by way of long-term loan capital, the people who consider themselves savvy, educated, smart and intelligent, that can put their money in for long terms of maybe 5, 6 or 10 years by way of loan notes and bonds. They're the guys who said, we can keep the sort of regulation overview control that we like on banks because we can sort of push on the boards of directors to do the things that we think should be done. And in turn, the pension fund managers who were the shareholders to some extent in the banks also felt that they could exert the control and checks that they wanted of the banks. But they didn't, and they failed. And the people who supplied the bulk of the funds necessary to do business for banks were the depositors. And the depositors, who aren't savvy, they're the people who've saved for maybe 5, 10 or 20 years in after-tax savings. They have entrusted that money to the banks. And the banks, not alone did they lend it all instead of keeping some of it back, but they lent even more on the whole short-term wholesale markets. Sure,
Chairman,
can I ask questions?
sure. Are we just talking about the past? Because
We're not.
I'd really love you to move on to the future, because my concern is that if we spend all our time looking at the past rather than saying, where should we go from here?
Yeah.
Would be interesting.
Now, I've said,
Peter,
Bank of Ireland...
could you indicate, based on the figures that have been provided to recapitalise the banks,
Yeah.
in your considered opinion, is that sufficient? What figure would you think would be needed?
I think the figures that, that my overview analysis show, which is supported by other independent analysts, and
give us a figure.
17.5 billion on top of what's gone in originally at 3.5 each to Bank of Ireland and AIB. And we will be able to even recover, I think, by putting in new capital to those two banks, owning them in sufficient...
How much above what the government proposed to put in do you think is required?
Out of the 17.5 billion that's needed in those two banks, I would propose that the government would put in up to 10, and that the bondholders in those two big banks...
No, but the government at the moment are providing AIB, they're looking for, isn't it 9.5?
No, 7.4.
7.4, and Bank of Ireland is
3.6, 3.7.
Okay, and we'll say Irish Nationwide is 2.
No, forget them, they should be
We'll say 9.4, you're talking then not, you're talking 12 billion, right? How much, so you're talking an extra 5 billion on top?
I would say that Nationwide should be wound up, as should Anglo-Irish Bank, and you each have a sheet of the least cost options of doing that.
Yeah, but how much in addition, AIB and Bank of Ireland, how much additional is required there above the 7.4, sorry, above the 9.4 and the 3.6 for Bank of Ireland? Is it 7.4 for AIB? Sorry.
I'm saying that between AIB and Bank of Ireland, they need 16.5 fresh capital. But it doesn't have to come from the state.
No, but that's
no, this is important.
That's an extra 4.5
This is important.
Billion.
Professor Ed Kane, who termed the phrase zombie banks, who's a respected international commentator and analyst in this area, like Professor Joe Stiglitz and others that you've all read about in the papers. Kane was here yesterday. He spoke on News Talk, and he would agree 100% that this thing of extending the safety net for the banks is wrong, because it doesn't address the problem of who put the capital up in the first place to create the mess, how big is the mess, and who should bear the cost of getting the mess cleaned up.